So, good evening, everybody. We're back. Every night we've been doing this, and we're broadcasting live here from my tiny home office, and I do my best to keep my little boys out of it because sometimes they come in and come out. But we're all dealing with that right now, right? We have our whole family with us, and I think we're learning more about other people's domestic lives right now, which is fun, but it sometimes it throws a wrench in the works here. Um, we're talking to everybody. We're talking about different issues across NY27 every single night. At the end of this, you'll have a chance to ask me questions if you have questions. But tonight, we're talking to my good friend, Gordon. Gordon, can you say hi to everybody? Tell the people who you are in brief.
Okay, well, I'm a volunteer for Nate's campaign. This is the second go round. I call it my sophomore year now. So got involved in your campaign very, very early, like in January and February of 2018. I became aware of it. Um, so I've recently retired last June, which is interesting timing going on what's going on now. But yeah, it was perfect timing for a lot of reasons. But worked in IT for most of my life as a consultant and a programmer and project manager, and and originally actually got started in it years ago. I was a salesman and enjoyed teaching people how to use computers, and I was better at teaching people than I was at selling them. So that became my niche. But most recently, I'm sorry, Nate. About 10 years ago, I started working in Victor. I was a consultant with IBM's Global Business Services at the time, and we won a contract to help Constellation Brands, headquartered here in Victor, with a very big global system upgrade and consolidation project. It was one of these, we call them aircraft carrier type of projects that went on for about 3 or 4 years before we finished it. And at the time, I was living on Long Island, and I was one of those road warrior kind of commuters who would fly or drive up to Rochester every week and then back home. And but I also had a very strong
connection. I got too many questions for you. The
okay.
First question is, how long? I didn't even know this. How long were you in Long Island for?
Well, I lived in downstate for almost 30 years. Like a lot of, originally I went to college in Ithaca and stayed there for a few years, but
Are
like
you
a lot of
from
young
Long
people.
Island originally?
Oh, no, no, I'm originally from the Midwest, actually. I call myself a Midwestern Canadian. Um,
Canadian citizen,
so
aren't you? Dual citizen.
I'm eligible for it. I just haven't pursued
Okay.
Canadian citizenship yet.
So I'm sorry to jump around, but your family grew up in. So where did you grow up? I thought for some reason I thought you grew up in Ithaca, but you went to college in Ithaca.
Yeah, it's kind of a long. My father was a musician and a college professor, and I was born in Kansas City, which is the area where his family is from. And we moved to Indiana and then to Toronto. He was a professor at University of Toronto for 3 years, but he missed living in the States, so we moved to Ithaca when I was a teenager. Um, and
then you got a career in data and computers, and they moved you out to IBM. Moved you out to Long Island. Where in Long Island?
I lived in Oceanside in Nassau County, South Shore of Nassau County. Um, which is one of the reasons I live in Victor now, is because um, when I had the opportunity to come to work,
it's kind of developed, right? It's like
yeah,
it's not like deep. It's not like the Hamptons or Montauk. It's close to the city, kind of, right? But it's still pretty in parts.
oh yeah, it was a beautiful area, beautiful beaches, um, and not far from JFK Airport, actually, in the Rockaways, that area.
Watching, we're going to talk about upstate and the beauty of upstate, but those Long Island beaches are dramatically underrated. They're not tropical beaches, but they're something special. They're kind of like Cape Cod, but Fire Island, the whole thing. It's beautiful down there. Don't you agree?
It is, but it's also a very fragile environment. And what we had, my wife and I had planned to move upstate anyway because of my mother continuing to live in Ithaca for a while, and we had a family vacation property in Cayuga County. So I've still, had big connections to the Finger Lakes, but we survived Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and which basically flooded half of the town I lived in. We were literally on the front line, and lived through a 12 days without electricity in November. And you were basically trapped. I mean, everything was, you couldn't even buy gas because everything was, no power anywhere. So it sort of prepared me a little bit for this experience we're all going through, is having lived through a period of just, well, all of a sudden the world stops on you. And
IBM, but isn't IBM's global headquarters in upstate, just above New York City, right?
and Armonk in Westchester County.
Yeah, I've been
But
there a couple times. So is
yeah,
that where you worked out of, or no?
you were on the road. My job as a consultant, you were usually working at a client site. You'd travel out on Sunday night or Monday morning and go back home Thursday night, and you know do your wash and turn around and do it, repeat. So
So
I
back
worked
in
in some really interesting places in different cities like Minneapolis and Baltimore and South Carolina and Hartford, Connecticut. So wherever a big project came up, and so the Constellation
jobs like that,
project
jobs like
took me
that
up
are going to
there.
change too, I think, in the future because of stuff like we're going through right now. I'd have to think. I mean, just the scale of travel that something like that's required, any type of consulting or even sales. Um, anyway, we'll get into that. So you came
Yeah,
back. So you worked for Constellation Brands. Were you always an outdoorsman?
pretty much so. Yeah, all my whole family were avid fishermen and hunters. The um, I learned how to fish. The property we own, we have a couple of ponds on it, and I'd always wanted to learn how to fly fish. I'd done conventional fishing, so we had stocked the pond with bluegills and bass and those type of fish, and so I taught myself how to fly fish. And then um, Long Island is, tremendous fishing. It's the biggest island in the United States, and you have the saltwater opportunity, and there's also excellent trout fishing on the island, which not a lot of people know about. So anyway, I just got into it and started to explore the fisheries of New York and the Catskills, and then eventually up in this Western New York area, which is a world-class fishing destination. A lot of us around here live here don't realize that unless you're into it. But
Just so everyone out there knows, we have 80% of North America's fresh water goes past Western New York. 20% of the world's, and we have some of the top fisheries and um, fishing experiences that you can possibly have in Western New York. And Gordon, what's the organization that you lead?
well, I'm a member of Trout Unlimited, which is a cold water conservation group, and that has several hundred chapters in the country. And so the one in Canandaigua Lake, it's called. I'm actually the chapter president of that group, and was also a member that we had another chapter on Long Island, and there's probably about a dozen or so of them in New York State. But this is the local group that. When I moved here, I was looking for a fishing club or organization to join, and so that all kind of fit in quite well too.
Types of fish you can catch around here, because I think people that grew up here their whole lives, don't realize how special it really is. So, can we talk about some of the unique types of trout and fish that you can catch?
Sure. Well, if you look at a map of the district, I mean, you can see we're surrounded by water on there. We have shoreline on Lake Erie, the lower Niagara River, Lake Ontario. Five of the Finger Lakes are in the district. The Genesee River runs through the district and Letchworth Park. And there's tributaries to the Genesee that are excellent trout fisheries. Um, and on this far southwest boundary, if you look at a map of the, you'll see like there's a kind of a squiggly line there. The border of the district is a stream called Cattaraugus Creek, which is really famous primarily for steelhead trout. Part of it the CAT, we call it, runs through the Seneca Nation reservation. The Zor Valley area, if you've heard of that, tremendous kayaking, and it's a really beautiful canyon, basically.
Let me pause you again. So he just threw a lot of information out there. So we have Lake Ontario, which everybody knows about, which is a gigantic lake. Lake Erie, less big. Lake Erie is a very dangerous lake for boating because it's shallow. It's shallow. Yes. It's like 200, 300 feet deep, where Lake Ontario is up like 800 feet deep, right?
Yeah. Actually, Lake Erie, though, probably, I read one book, it estimates about 50% of the fish in the Great Lakes are in Erie because of that shallow water. So it's a tremendous fishery. And then there's
a lot of wave action on that lake compared to Ontario. Even it's beautiful, but you can feel, and historically there was a lot of shipwrecks on that water.
Oh yeah, yeah. And
those, for people who are watching who aren't from here, these lakes are oceans. They're giant. I mean, they're massive.
They're freshwater seas is a better way to describe them. They're not lakes
freshwater seas. And then you have the Niagara River, which has some great fishing, especially the lower Niagara, right?
Yeah, Lewiston area. There are a number of charter captains that are based out of there. And what I enjoy particularly are the tributaries of the lakes, and there's some spectacular streams where you get basically a migration of the trout from the lakes into the streams to spawn and feed and so forth. And then so they kind of go back and forth between these small creeks and the big lakes. And as a result, you get species like brown trout and steelhead trout, really large, fish. It's not uncommon to catch a 28-inch, 24-inch, 2-foot long fish locally.
You're getting a brown trout this big, which they only exist in a few places in the world, like here and where else? Patagonia, right?
In New Zealand, Patagonia, and Lake Ontario tributaries have the reputation of the biggest brown trout in the world. So it's a lot easier for me to drive 45 minutes to fish in one of the Ontario lake tributaries than to fly to New Zealand or somewhere. It's amazing. It is really amazing.
So these tributaries, we talk about tributaries, we're talking about the streams that are everywhere, that are between the lakes and the Finger Lakes. The Finger Lakes, by the way, are, I got to say, there's so many people who live in the Buffalo area who have never even gone to explore the Finger Lakes. And I tell people all the time, it's an hour and a half away. Go, because it's incredible. Like Seneca Lake, Cayuga Lake, these lakes are beautiful. I mean, really stunning. Watkins Glen, these kind of incredible geographic features, and all these little beautiful towns that are there. So, but you like to fish in the tributaries, which means the little streams that feed the big lakes.
Yeah. And also I fish a lot in the Finger Lakes themselves, more in the eastern lakes, Cayuga and Skinny Atlas, and the lakes over more towards the Syracuse area. But there's excellent fishing in those in the Finger Lakes too. And then within our district, we have called the Little Lakes, which are Hemlock and Honeoye, Canisius Lake, and each of them is a very good fishery in their own right. So it's a really big recreational aspect of the economy of the area. Because we attract tourists from around the world actually to fish in some of these streams. So it's quite a resource.
I would say Hemlock is not a little lake either. It's like the Canisius. These are pretty big lakes.
Yeah.
I think Hemlock's particularly pretty because that's the reservoir lake for Rochester, correct?
Yeah, Hemlock and Canadice, which is the smallest Finger Lake, are part of the Rochester's water supply, and as a result, there's no cottages, there's no development on the shoreline, and they're really even not just if you just want to kayak or canoe and not even fish, but just go to someplace that's just solitude with no other people. Both
Hemlock is a perk at it, even if you don't want to fish, like he's saying. I hate to say it, there's rarely anybody there. And they have these giant oak trees, and they had this a long time ago, probably during the Great Depression. They built this stone staircase that goes up to the lake. And like he said, there's no houses around the lake. And you walk up that staircase, it's not very long, but it almost is like you're going into heaven or Elysium or something. And the whole
Yeah.
sky in the summertime is full of stars because there's nothing around there. And it's really just stunningly beautiful. Can you
Yeah, they
fish,
also
or have
restrict boat traffic on both of those little lakes, so you're not allowed to take anything. I think it's larger than a 10 horsepower motor. Most people use electric motors or kayak or so forth. So there's no large, boats running around or jet skis or any of that stuff. So just
kayaks
beautiful.
on those lakes, but I didn't even know you could take an electric motor on.
Yeah.
Okay, so but if you want to charter a Lake Ontario or Lake Erie fishing vessel, you can go get what's out there. There's some big fish out there too, right?
Yeah, there, especially in Lake Ontario. There's always been a pretty big charter fleet, and some of those folks are hurting though because of the flooding in the past couple of years. You've seen all the headlines of the shoreline flooding in Lake Ontario. I believe the little town of Wilson on the lake there, and I was speaking to some of the captains there, and the things like docks were damaged by those floods, and so it's a precarious way to make a living. But it is it does like
I have a friend who runs one of those, and he showed me the water damage from last year. It was shocking. Like their entire, like you said, the dock system and the pier itself was completely overflowed by water. And
yeah.
I mean, I sometimes there's this theory out there that these people are irresponsible, but why did they build so close to the water? Well, these villages and these homes have been there for 100 years. Like Wilson is a very pretty, quaint town that's been there for 200 years, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of these houses, like they never had this problem before, and they have reinforced the waterfront as much as they can, but there's little you can do because of mismanagement, I would say, and to some extent, and also probably because of global warming. Is that right?
Yeah, particularly, and it's funny, the problem 10 years ago, we had the opposite problem in the Great Lakes, if you remember, where they were shrinking. And all of a sudden, people's boat dock was high and dry because the shoreline had receded. And the past few years, we've had the opposite problems. Most of it's due to heavy rain, particularly in upstream of lake in like Ohio and the Midwest. They had some just catastrophic flooding. And anything that falls Lake Erie's or Huron or Michigan, it all goes downstream over the falls and into Ontario.
I told you this thing was going to fall, Gordon. It fell. Keep going. Keep going. I'm listening to you.
Okay. So I can't see it, so which is fine. I don't want to mess around with my.
It's all right. We'll keep going.
So
this is what we do on live TV here.
But a lot
let
of
me ask you this. Keep going. Okay. I'm listening to you. Go ahead.
No, the one of the challenges and one of the resources you need to guard for us is the Great Lakes, and there's been so much man-made goofing around with the lakes over the years, and with problems like invasive species. I think most people have heard of zebra mussels.
They have.
And
so tell people here listening what they can do, how they want to get involved in the outdoors. What could they do when they want to be involved in fishing and fishing experiences?
Well, let's see. A good place. New York has one of the best things in New York is the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and right. They just have lots and lots of resources. They have maps of any part of the state you can think of. They'll like really detailed maps of the lakes we've been talking about. You can go find where the parking areas are. In June, hopefully we can do it again this year, but they have a license-free holiday in the last weekend of June to encourage people to go out and fish, and your license fees, which are pretty inexpensive. It's only $25 for a fishing license, but that helps fund conservation. Right now, there's a lot of trout stocking going on in some of these streams, and so that's always been April 1st on what's that, Wednesday. is the traditional opening day for trout. So it's like a holiday that day, and so there's just tremendous opportunities. I pray that we can still afford to do these things, after the financial hit we're going to take here. The state's really going to be beat up, but for now, the DEC is a good place to start. And then the internet's just a great thing. Our club has a very active Facebook group, and that you're in actually. So
I am.
yeah.
I love seeing the photographs of the fish because I can't believe people are able to catch those things. I mean,
Yeah.
I've never had such success. I'll be honest with you.
Well, we'll have to get you out there sometime. So and get you to meet some of these other people. There's some people in TU who I work with who are part of our government affairs group. One thing, if I could mention, one challenge
Sure.
we've got is, with the current EPA under Trump, they, if everyone remembers in January, it seems like a year or so ago, but there was all sorts of flurry of kind of outrageous things coming out every day. It was during the impeachment trial, but one of them was that the Trump's EPA repealed a 2015 Obama regulation called the Clean Water Rule, which basically was designed to strengthen the 1972 Clean Water Act, which is the only reason we can catch fish like this is because back in the 70s and 60s, we realized, hey, let's quit polluting the Great Lakes and, let them recover. And so the 2015 Act was designed to increase the protection to wetlands, which is really important for the health of any ecosystem and other seasonal streams. Well, it was fought by developers and farming interests and so forth as being too restrictive, and was on Trump's bullseye pretty quickly after he was elected. So there's numerous lawsuits against the EPA to reinstate the original rule. And the repeal of it there was no scientific basis for it. It was just, they didn't like it. That was probably because it was Obama's regulation. But that's was a really significant thing that happened in January, and it was kind of buried in all the noise of other events going on then.
For your patience through all of that, I don't know if you heard some of the fumbling back here, but I'll fix the banner later.
Okay.
Let me ask you, if what's the biggest threat to our ecosystem here and to the fishing industry here besides the current coronavirus threat? What are the other major threats? Is pollution? Can we eat these fish? I know people do. I know I have.
Personally, I do not eat fish that come out of the Great Lakes. The DEC has a recommendation that you not eat them more than once a month, and don't eat them if you're women who are pregnant. And so that's enough of a warning that I'm not going to. They're probably perfectly fine, but the older I get, the fewer fish I harvest and eat. My theory is there's plenty of fish in the grocery store that are already dead that you can eat. But we don't need to.
So like where you're talking about Minneapolis earlier, walleye is on every single restaurant.
Right?
And I assume some of that is caught naturally or in the wild, or am I wrong?
A lot of the walleye you get and I had fun working out there. That actually is from Canada, but it is caught. They are wild fish that are commercially caught, mostly in Canada, and then imported to restaurants. It's also
go ahead.
Well, Lake Erie is also a tremendous walleye fishery, especially the western basin of it in Ohio. I fished a lot out there, and it's a huge tourist part of the economy in western Ohio. The kind of Sandusky and Toledo area is kind of the walleye capital of the world almost. So it's a big it's an important recreational and aspect to our economy. And the threat is a couple of threats. One of them is from phosphorus, from farm runoff, which is something that really has to be watched because that literally fertilizes water. And as with warming temperatures, that's where you get aquatic weed growth. And we've had also on some of the Finger Lakes what's called blue-green algae blooms in the summer.
Massive blooms in Lake Erie, correct?
Yeah, and that stuff is actually, let me read, it's not quite an algae, it's a bacteria toxin. It's called microcystis. And it's poisonous. I mean, people have had their dogs die that went, and jumped in a lake because there was one of these blooms going on. And the city of Toledo actually had to close its water system a few years back because of an algae bloom in Lake Erie. So, that's a real threat to our waterways. Yeah.
I mean, if you like, when I was a kid, I don't remember seeing blooms like that in Lake Erie. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, that's a growing problem.
Yeah, and usually happens late in the summer, especially if it's hot, which we've had, these really hot summers, and we've had them in the Finger Lakes too. I think Honeoye Lake had a bloom either last year or maybe the year before. So it's not just the Great Lakes, but smaller bodies of water, and so that's one of the partnerships you have to have, especially with the agricultural community, is to make sure that they're protecting wetlands, protecting if there's a stream that goes through their property, to have they call it riparian buffer, which basically means you want to have a lot of bushes and trees along the bank of your a really good, 20, 50 yards of woods alongside a stream to absorb any agriculture runoff.
I know they're asking a lot of people around there's a lot of classes that have been about this, how they can create a riparian buffer, and I know the DEC's offered a lot of material about this. Before we go any further, I want to go into politics for a second, because this is I'm running for office. Before I do that, I want to throw some different types of fish out there, and I want to get your opinion about them, about catching them, and what it's like to catch them, or whether you've caught them. Is that fun?
Sure.
All right.
What do you want to know?
What's the biggest fish you ever caught?
Let's see. The biggest fish I hooked was a bluefin tuna off the coast of Montauk, and it was like I hooked a moving Volkswagen or something. So that was only on for about 30 seconds. And he snapped the line. Biggest one I've landed was probably a striped bass off of Cape Cod. And then around here, the biggest fish I've caught are these steelhead and brown trout, and also the Chinook salmon that were stocked in Lake Ontario.
Right, so, they're not naturally occurring here, right?
All of these species are introduced species. The native fish in Lake Ontario were lake trout, and what else? Atlantic salmon, actually, but they disappeared in Lake Ontario in the 1800s. But they're trying to bring back Atlantic salmon into Lake Ontario.
At the spawning season, people don't know this. At the spawning season, you can almost walk across salmon in the lower Niagara. There are so many salmon at different parts of the year. I haven't done it in a long time, but when I was a kid, we used to go down there, and it was like, it was incredible. I didn't. Is it still like that? I haven't been down there in years.
No, it's not. At least for the salmon, and that's part of the kind of the evolving fishery in the Great Lakes. The Pacific salmon were introduced to control the overpopulation of a species of herring called alewives that had overpopulated the lakes, mostly because the lake trout were decimated by a parasitic fish called a sea lamprey. This is just a whole snowball effect. So the original predators died off, so the forage fish overpopulated. So they introduced salmon into starting in Lake Michigan, and then eventually into all the lakes. But what they're finding now is the bait fish, the alewife population is crashing. And so the salmon have not adapted to other fish. So that's where other species like the brown trout and the steelhead rainbow trout are actually becoming more prevalent in the lakes, and the salmon fishery is starting to decline.
for those who don't know, it's beautiful. It's a big fish, and it's a beautiful fish. You ever
The only
catch
thing
the
not beautiful about them, they die after they spawn. And so when you're fishing during salmon season in the fall, you get a lot of floaters going by you.
Wait, that tuna, if you would have caught that, it's worth some money, isn't it? I mean, aren't don't those things go for big money?
They
I mean,
can, yeah. Actually, they.
Not that you're going to sell it, but.
Yeah, particularly you'll get Japanese sushi buyers that will frequent the docks out in, in Montauk and in places like that.
How about a muskie? You ever catch a muskie?
No, I've caught a lot of northern pike, especially in the Finger Lakes, in Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake. You have really big northern pike, and I catch those fly fishing. I use a fly. It's a bait fish imitation. We call it a streamer, but caught some really big pike.
Those northern pike are pretty tough.
Yeah, they are. They're fun too. They're big jumpers and they're very aggressive. There's also incredible bass fishing in this area too, and a lot of times in the warmer weather, you'll kind of shift your focus from trout, which are cold water species, to bass, which are warmer water species. So it's
when I fish in the summer, and it's almost all smallmouth bass.
Yeah,
where I am, and people will pull them out. Seriously, they'll pull 20 of them out of the water in a day.
The smallmouth bass are incredible game fish in this area.
Illegal. What people should not be doing.
Well, most folks,
right?
Well, you want to stick to the limits that DEC has set, which for the most part, that's actually one thing that's changed just this year, is they reduced the number of fish you can keep. So down to like one or two, only one or two of these big trout are you allowed to actually keep now. So there is actually some underground criminal groups that will come up and poach brown trout, female brown trouts for the eggs, believe it or not. And there's groups from like Eastern Europe and places that there's a black market for trout eggs. And so that's one of the things the DEC has to enforce. A lot of times they'll.
What do they do with those trout eggs? They eat them or what?
There's like caviar, yeah, but they'll literally strip the eggs out of the females and bottle and jar them and sell them in Ukraine or other countries like that. So that's a big problem. Basically people not obeying the rules and the sportsmanship, but there is this criminal element.
Right? That's a screenplay right there. Some Eastern European gang coming in to steal the trout eggs.
Yeah.
Wow. Let's switch gears here, Gordon. Gordon, listen, I want to say thank you to you. I think you are an incredible. You're more than a volunteer. Let's be honest. You are. Everyone who knows you across NY27 that's been involved in my campaign in 2018 or now knows you are a workhorse. You're relentless. You're kind. Everyone on my team loves you. The people that work with you love you because you have a mission. And you're involved in the postcard thing now, but more than that, Gordon, like you just have a spirit about you, and you're selfless rather, and really altruistic about the way you approach politics. Thank you. I mean, I don't know what to say, but like, tell me why you so driven.
Well, one of the things I discovered pretty early, actually, probably my professional career in IT actually prepared me for what a political campaign was like, because it was basically all project based, and you always had a tough project with a hard deadline, like an election day. Usually you had a certain month, and you had to hit that go live date, or delaying a project would cost the client thousands or millions of dollars. So you had that pressure. You never had enough money, never had enough resources, enough people that you needed to really do what you wanted to do, but you just had to take this attitude to do whatever you take. So a lot of that work ethic I learned from doing these big computer projects actually translated a lot to the campaign work. And So that was a big part of it. And then it was just the time of 2018 and what was going on in the country, and the opportunity to flip to the House of Representatives, at least get that back, and then the trigger for me was actually Chris Collins voting for the Trump tax cut that limited our SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction. And that, to me, was really just a political thing aimed at blue states that had strong, state
Let me pause you on that.
Mm-hmm.
I do not understand why so many GOP advocates and activists aren't furious by that 2018 tax law. I do not get it. All we ever heard about for 15 years from Tea Party guys is about taxation and how it was wrong and improper. And then the GOP passes a tax law that punishes New York State, and they bend over backwards to make excuses for it. I can't understand it. Let me hear your take on it.
Well, one of the best, most angry responses to that was at that time, New York had 9 Republican congressmen, and 5 of them voted against the bill because of that. And my former congressman, Peter King from Long Island, he was on, I think it was Meet the Press or one of those shows, and he just went off on a tirade about what the GOP was doing and called it a self-inflicted wound. And, and particularly downstate, in Long Island and Westchester, where property taxes are even higher than here. I mean, it's really hurting middle-class homeowners. So that was the spark that, and what I started investigating after that passed is, well, who the heck is running against this guy Collins, who voted for this thing? And that's how I ended up finding out about you and going to some of those early rallies in Lancaster and Buffalo and so forth. So
I think I always tell people they don't understand how many people we had at the rallies before the indictment. Like, you remember, but a lot of people, there was a lot of people that were behind us, angry at Collins, and on our campaigns, on our side, a long time before the indictment was at the end of the campaign. If the indictment happened maybe 7 months earlier, it would have been great for us. But we already had built a grassroots, support system at that point. And you were an early part of that system, and I appreciate it. Do you think we're more prepared this time because we already had done a lot of that legwork and people know who we are and we have a system? I sure do.
Yeah, we certainly, I think we have more recognition. I am concerned maybe because it's just all the other, of course, the events of the past month are just threw a wrench and everything. But because I don't know that the news about the special election had gotten out enough. So I haven't felt the same, juice, I'll call it, yet in this special election campaign. A lot of, the diehards like myself and Cindy and a lot of our other friends, have been gung ho. But actually, I was hoping to be able to put my yard signs out this weekend.
We can't campaign. I'm talking to you on the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been difficult. I mean, we had so many events planned, but we can't let it get us down. We have 2.5 months now to go. We got to be pushing forward. We got to be out there reaching out to people. And I think we've written, our teams have written how many postcards? I guess total over 20,000 postcards.
That's our rough guess. I think it might. I know personally, I'm responsible for about 5,000, and there's a group in Geneseo, Kate Alonso, I believe is the leader of, I think they have wrote every Democrat in Livingston County. So it's a big. I'm glad you brought that up because sometimes I feel like we're kind of the Rodney Dangerfield part of the campaign. We don't get no respect. But
no, well, I know you feel that way sometimes because you're alone and you're doing it on your own, but I respect it greatly, and I am grateful to you. Everyone, think about it, 20,000 handwritten postcards. That's incredible. Every Democrat in Livingston County. Whether you said, listen, talk about juice. I don't see anything like this from the other side. All I see from that side is commercial buying and hope that people don't pay attention to the issues enough and only vote party lines. I mean, that's what it comes down to. They're hoping that enrollment and money can buy them the election. but we have
Yeah.
people writing thousands and thousands and thousands of postcards. Uh, I know you felt some sadness in the past about organization versus the east side of the district versus the west side of the district. Um, I don't want to go to listen. Don't cause more friction than we already have. But why do you think there is so much organization on the east side of the district?
Part of it, I think, is just the demographic of Ontario and the parts of Monroe County that are in the district. We kind of fit that suburban model that even in the off-year elections in 2017, you started to see in states like Virginia, I think, and where all of a sudden Democrats were winning, and they were winning special elections. And it was usually because of suburban voters, particularly suburban women voters, who started really supporting Democratic candidates. So I think this area, I felt that very early in the campaign in 2018, really fit that profile of that suburban profile. I honestly don't know the Buffalo West Side as well as this area. So I drive through it a lot if I fish.
It's kind of incredible. It is kind of incredible the type of organization we have in a lot of those towns, in Canandaigua and in Victor and in South Bristol. And to anyone who's watching from those areas, I'm grateful for all your support. And every time I come out, your effort and commitment is amazing. And Gordon, you're a huge part of that. Well,
Yeah,
Gordon,
thank
listen,
you.
Gordon.
Can I just brag about one thing I did in 2018?
Of course, go ahead. Yeah.
So my little election district, we're District ED7 in Victor. We actually, your margin of victory, you got 64% of the votes in 2018 in my little district. So just my neighborhood basically was not just me, but dozens and hundreds of people.
No, we did very well in a lot of places. People thought we didn't have a chance, and then the margin of victory out there in Victor was incredible. And I have to say, it's because we had a great captain out in Victor, and I believe we can do it again. I just think as soon as this whole thing dies down, we have to get together and get ready to push. And it's gonna be a complete sprint. I mean, obviously, we're still having weekly calls. We're still coordinating. But I'm stuck in here. I'm stuck in my house, so it's driving me nuts. But especially because we're so grassroots. But listen, what do you think about what's going to happen? What do you think about our country right now? And I want to ask you about the president. So many people. I'm going to tell you my personal frustration. I've obviously been a big. I think the president's a fiasco. I think it's a disaster, and I think the fact that so many Democratic leaders are still afraid to say what I just said, it's shameful. I'm sorry, it's shameful. We have to be willing to say what's happening. We are losing a grip on what makes America special. And I don't know what you would think about this, Gordon. We've never really talked about this. We talk more about local issues, you and I. But I think nationally, I think this is crazy what's happening in our country. And I think unless we start to say that boldly, it's going to continue. It's going to normalize it unless we fight against it. What's your thoughts?
It is unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime. Dwight Eisenhower was president when I was born, so I've seen a few presidents. There's I don't know. I'm trying to watch my words so I don't start cussing or something. But personally, as an environmentalist, a conservationist, which I consider myself, I mean, what Trump has done with the EPA and the denial of science and suppression of scientific findings and things is just. I mean, this is the 21st century. I mean, what kind of thought control kind of nonsense is that? Right away, one of the first things he did was pull us out of the Paris Climate Accord, along with Syria and some other godforsaken place. I mean, right. It's just, mind-boggling. I understand somewhat the appeal of the president because of how we allowed our manufacturing sector to decline for so many years, and I do think he did speak to that anguish, and especially when you look at the states that voted for him in the Midwest and so forth. But and to me, he's the biblical phrase. I think a false prophet is what I consider him. And so we'll see. We just have
Anything
to.
for manufacturing.
Yeah.
I mean, that we're 3 years in, manufacturing hasn't returned to our region. It hasn't returned to the Midwest, and because it's a lie. Because here's two things. Number one, a lot of those manufacturing jobs no longer exist. Period.
Right.
No longer exist in Mexico. No longer exist in Asia. Do not exist. The manufacturing jobs that do exist have been largely automated, and that's a difficult thing to accept. The third part of it is we're going to have to invest a lot in education to pull up and salvage the manufacturing jobs that still do exist, which he doesn't seem willing to do. And the last thing I'll say about it is he hasn't really changed any of the trade policies he said were so terrible. I mean, the new NAFTA is essentially the same as the old NAFTA. So I think false prophet. I think he's a charlatan. He is talking. He talks the talk. He's a salesman who wants you to feel good, but doesn't really have any substance whatsoever. He's not willing to take on the hard issues that are affecting people here. And I just don't get why people still are buying it after 3 years. And I think part of the reason they're still buying it, every mayor, every supervisor, every county executive has to say he is a threat to democracy. Until we start to talk like that, people are going to think it's acceptable to have Trump 2020 signs up, and they think it's acceptable to support President Trump. And I understand fully that it may cost me votes to say that, but I hope people listening understand that at least I'm honest, and at least I have an opinion, and I'm not thinking these things but really saying something else. This is what I believe. I believe that President Trump is probably has many talents, but he is hiding his weaknesses with sales and with lies and with deceit. And I think if we don't fix it, the country's going to be forever changed for the worse.
I find the divisiveness really just saddening. Like the other day when this recovery or whatever this act was passed, the $2 trillion thing. Most normal presidents I've seen, Ronald Reagan or either of the Bushes or so, a big bill like that, you'd have, the Speaker of the House and, a bipartisan group of senators. And all he had were, the Republicans, at the signing ceremony. I mean, come on, man. It's the vindictiveness, against states that didn't vote for him is really troubling. It's not how.
We could talk about it all night. I mean,
yeah.
I agree with you. I think, and many of us, including myself, would love to rally behind him right now. He's not giving us anything to rally behind.
No.
He's simply trying to play politics in a time when politics is we have to be above politics. What Cuomo said today, and there's a lot of things Cuomo has done which I didn't like, but what Governor Cuomo said today is there are no red states, there are no blue states. We're all together right now. And that's the spirit we need. And I wish the president, I could look beyond a lot of the things he's done if he gave people right now a sense of hope and a sense of vision that we can get through this crisis together. And the fact that he doesn't seem willing to do that, it further amplifies my concerns about this man.
Yeah. Well, just to remember, like how we felt about President Bush, W. Bush, in 2001 after 9/11. I mean, his approval rating was something like 80%. I mean, even after that election, we rallied behind, and he, for all his other faults, he did, step up and do the right things and say the right things. So
far beyond what we see today, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, Gordon, any last things you want to say?
Well, one, an issue you brought up at a lot of the town halls and so forth that I've been to is about the need for improved bandwidth and broadband infrastructure. And one thing this crisis is pointing out is just how badly we need that. Everyone's online. The kids are going to school online, the people have to work from home, they're streaming movies. And I don't know about you, but, my signals are dropping, response times are slow. I know we've had a couple of these online things kind of get goofed up, not really because of a software problem, it's probably just, traffic.
Day
and
that the people in Farmington plugged and plugged and plugged. Thank you, Farmington, for doing that. And it didn't connect. And we had 30 people on the line. And it was nothing to do with our software, like you said. It was simply the fact that the bandwidth was too slow.
yeah,
Look at my speed when I lived overseas 10 years ago was faster than it is now in Western New York. And I spent $100 a month on my internet speeds. So it isn't acceptable, and I wish people would be more angry about it. It's a very fixable problem. This is not an unfixable problem. We could
yeah.
easily create a network of broadband. I don't know why we haven't done it yet.
No, I mean, fiber optic cable has been around, since the 90s. I mean, it's at least 30 years old. It's not new technology. It's to replace a copper wire with fiber optic.
Hey, we're literally sending our internet over wire that was laid down 100 years ago, copper wire.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're using to transmit our internet in a lot of places in NY27. It's crazy. I just think we should not accept it anymore. When we listen right now, it's about getting through this crisis. But when we get through this crisis, we have to look at the future of the country, and the future of the country has to be creating rural broadband, not rural broadband, broadband for the entire country.
Yeah.
Because obviously it's the future, and we have to be able to communicate and connect. We're social beings, and we're beings to create business, enterprise, and opportunity. We need internet. So, well, Gordon, I'm going to let you go, and I'm going to try to fix this sign for tomorrow.
Okay, sounds good. I'll have to watch it.
You okay? Everything? Are you good? Wait, are you everything good at home? Everything? You need anything?
No, I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. Getting a little stir crazy, but at least we've had nice weather during not your typical March, right? Imagine we had like a couple of feet of snow on top of what we're going through, but
Yeah. Well, when it gets safe to see each other again, let's go fly. I've never been fly fishing. I've been fishing many, many, many times. I've never been fly fishing, so you got to take me.
Okay, we'll do. Know how to do it too.
Thanks.
Okay, good night.